to the Fantasy Footballers DFS Podcast with your hosts, Kyle Borg and Matthew Betz.
Welcome in to a very, very hot summer here in Arizona. It's the Fantasy Footballers DFS Podcast. I am your host, Kyle Borg, and I'm with Matthew. Wait a second, it's not Betz, DiSorbo. Matt DiSorbo, special guest. How are you doing, man?
Hey, Kyle, how's everything going? It's great to be here. I'm a huge fan of the DFS Pod, so it's an honor to be subbing in for Betz, who is newly anointed dad life, and shout out to him. Amazing stuff there. But really excited for the show today. I think we have a good show coming, and I'm excited to dive into it with you. Yeah.
So DiSorbo, those of you who don't know, is one of our writers at thefantasyfootballers.com, and we'll kind of get into just a second his backstory, how he got involved, and I think it's just fascinating in general. If you think about fantasy football, no one went to college and majored in fantasy football as their main thing. Like, everyone comes from so many different parts of, academia, and this is your former job. I've been a teacher. Betz is a physical therapist. So I love that kind of we get this hodgepodge approach of, across different disciplines, and you kind of get people's area of expertise. So today we're going to be talking about best ball variance and volatility, and kind of look at different players and how the math works out. DiSorbo and Betz put out an article that we teased last week, and we're going to get to unveil that. But yes, if you're wondering how Betz is doing, he is alive. Him and his wife, Monica, they had twin girls. And I was texting with Betz last night. Fatherhood is a big step, but when you're adding two, it is a big deal. I know you're not at that point, DiSorbo, but dad life, dude. What advice can you give the people about dad life?
I am not there yet. One day I hope to get there. So my advice will probably fall flat, but I think Betz puts it best, and that's a little bit of a tongue twister. Betz puts it best. I think if you have a couple of best ball lineups lined up best ball drafts lined up for that first week, probably going to make the adjustment period a bit easier. So I think having fantasy as an outlet during that time is the best advice that I can give as a young man.
For sure. You need different weird outlets. I've told people before, I did a 3-month thing with Pro Football Focus when we had my first child. So I looked at game film of college football players, especially there's a lot of games in the WAC, so I'd have a lot of games that would go like 55, 45, and have to chart all those games. So you find some weird things to get into because your hours are going to look different. So we'll get to hear from Betz in a couple of weeks, but I want to open up and kind of get people to get to know you. So I personally have got to know you as a friend, someone that I feel a lot of confidence in asking you big questions, but Jason and I have also talked to you a lot about projections and how that works. And so let's talk a little bit about your background. People have heard you tease before as you're at Harvard. So quickly, tell people about what program you're in right now.
Definitely. And I think this speaks to what you were mentioning about fantasy as a way to bring people together that might not necessarily interact in a different setting. And I think that's a really cool thing about fantasy, other than winning money, right? It's cool to be able to communicate with people. So I'm in a first year. I guess I'm finishing my first year of a PhD program. The name is kind of long and complicated, but it boils down to data science. I'm focused on data science and specifically how it works kind of in the business context. But that allows me to use a lot of data science skills of scraping, aggregating, organizing data to hopefully try to say some interesting things about fantasy football. I've always loved football, and I've always loved analytics, and fantasy football is a way to kind of merge those two interests. So hopefully I've been able to do that through some of articles and insights and generally on the Twitter sphere.
You're speaking my love language when it comes to just scraping large amounts of data and then asking big questions. I mean, I think that's the best part about fantasy football research is you ask a big enough question, and it's okay if you don't know the answer right off. You get to let the data speak for itself. So I love that. We have lots of different research tools and stuff on the website, fantasyfootballers.com, and you actually got to influence our auction tools this year in the Ultimate Draft Kit and be a part of that. So it's really cool. Give me your first fantasy memory. So, when you first started getting into fantasy football, give me one of those first ones.
Yeah, it's a good question. And you have to go far back. I think it was 6 or 7. So around 2002, 2003, my dad sat us down at the kitchen table and said, "You guys like football? You seem to like numbers. So let's try this new thing, fantasy football." Set up a league on ESPN. It was a 4-team league, me, my brother, and my parents, which is hilarious because the teams are all just super stacked. My team was named the Matt Pies because I still do, but I also really liked pie at the time. And I won the inaugural season for our league, and it's kind of continued along the way. We've added people. It's a 12-team league now. It's in its 20 or 21st year. But it's one of those things where I feel like I grew up with fantasy, and I feel like a lot of listeners probably have a similar experience where they're young. A mentor, a parent, a friend gets them into it, and it kind of just goes from there. So I like to think of fantasy as kind of part of my core memory in life.
And what I love about you is you got connected, one of our writers that you applied a couple years ago, and I'm actually in that process of finalizing that right now. Our last couple of writers will be announced the next week or so of our new crop. But what attracted me most to you and your application was I knew you were good at math, those kind of things, but you loved the Spitballers. Like, you actually loved the other show that we get to do that is just nonsense. If you haven't checked that out, Spitballers Pod, just a fun off season. But yeah, tell me about like what got you into that from like a math perspective, because it's a comedy podcast.
Totally. So I think it was, I forget exactly what it was, but Mike referenced a draft done on the Spitballers. And I love drafting. I love ranking things. I love analyzing things. So the draft seemed right up my alley. I went back and listened to all, the drafts of like the first 100 episodes or something, and did a little bit of data crunching to see who the best drafter was. Spoiler alert, it's usually Jason, which I'm sure he'd be happy to hear. But that's how I kind of got hooked. I would listen to the drafts, and then I said, oh, these are pretty good, and would go back and listen to the whole episode. And now it's like, the footballers, the Spitballers, I'm equally excited when each of them drops. So I think it's just a cool way. If you haven't checked it out, this is a great plug. Check out Spitballers Pod. It's just a good way to, get even more involved with the brand in a non-football, just totally fun setting. And
we are not holding him hostage to say that. He really does enjoy the show. I do too. I listen with my kids. All right, well, last thing, and then we'll get into our main topic of the show. I want you to demystify Harvard, because when people hear that name or we reference it, people have their ideas from movies or whatever of, this is what Harvard's like, this is what it's like getting into Harvard, this is what everyone's like. So any stereotypes or anything you want to demystify about that school?
Yeah, really good question. And I love to talk about Harvard. I think it's a really amazing and interesting place with a lot of cool history and quirks. So we can talk about it as much as you want. I think one quick thing is the movie The Social Network, where they talk about the founding of Facebook. I actually think that does a very good job kind of describing the social scene of Harvard. I think it kind of hits that on the nose. But in terms of stereotypes you mentioned, my biggest stereotype going in, which I probably think is shared by a lot of people, I arrived on campus as a freshman, and I said, look at all these nerds. They are going to be super nerdy, super into the books, staying in the library up late, just not doing anything. And I'm not a super athletic person, but I'm decently athletic. And I said, okay, I'm gonna show everyone how to throw a football. I'm gonna be the star of the soccer team and the baseball team, and the basketball team, and I'm gonna be the coolest kid around. I'm gonna be, the most magnetic, the funniest. And I showed up the first day, and I met my roommates, and they were very smart, and they were very athletic, and they were very cool, and they had great personalities and played all these types of instruments. And what I learned was that Harvard is a place where you do have people who are extremely good at one thing, really good at playing the violin, really good at doing math, really good at writing. But most of the people at Harvard are just kind of jack of all trades, where they're very good in a bunch of different areas. And that was something that completely blew my mind, because I was expecting the opposite. I just had my 5-year reunion this weekend. That's why my voice is a little bit rusty. And it's really cool to see how those people have kind of branched off into different parts of life. So it's a very cool place, very stimulating, very exciting. And it's been a pleasure to be involved with it.
No, and I'll just say for the show, Fantasy Footballers, it's benefited us. I think Jason's the best in terms of pandering and shamelessly giving plugs, but it has been good to be able to say your name and any of our writers. I love being able to put in the show docs articles that I feel confident in and articles that I think actually have influenced. And so there's a lot of things that we've referenced this past year on the DFS show. I know there's one about matchups that has been really helpful to be able to not overvalue, hey, this defense is really, really good against, wide receivers. It's like, hey, Devontae Adams is good. Ignore the matchup. Who cares? Like, things like that. So, yeah, I'm excited for that. And if you want to get in on some of those insights from DiSorbo, from myself, Betz, the Ultimate Draft Kit we have available online right now, Best Ball Primer, Best Ball Rankings. It gets updated weekly. And everything else you want in the Ultimate Draft Kit, we tell people, if you want a friend on the toilet, don't invite your friend, but we'll give you one. We'll give you a friend with the UDK app that you can use anytime you want. So go to ultimatedraftkit.com, and the full DFS pass will launch as we get closer in August. But you're here for best ball, so let's talk about it.
Let's do it.
Best Ball Bonanza.
We are still trucking in the summer of best ball. We've only hit June. It's I tweeted this out, but this week it really hit me how hot it is here in Arizona in terms of the heat. Like the high every single day is going to be above 105. Like it's a given.
Oof.
And the humbling part is the evening. I forget what life was like in Atlanta and other parts of the U.S., but and around the world, those of you listening. But the reality is it stays in the high 90s at night. So
my gosh.
What do I do? Like, how do I approach this? I don't have a game plan. I just kind of moved here. But it was 97 last night at about 8:30. Any thoughts, DiSorbo, what I should do?
Oh my goodness. So I'm from the Northeast, and this summer I'm in Seattle where it's not as hot. I don't know what you're gonna do. I don't know if you're like this. I feel like I'm similar to Jason, where I'm pretty good in the cold. I can handle myself, but my brain starts to shut down as soon as we get north of 80, 85 degrees. So, I guess like tie bags of ice to your feet and kind of walk around. I wish I could help you, but I'm curious to learn your kind of crash course after dealing with your first Arizona summer.
I would say just quickly, middle of the day siestas are real. Like with our kids, like in the summer, we like pull down the curtains and we tell them like, hey, like from about 1 to 3, that is a period where it is going to be quiet in our house. Nobody's going to go outside. So people really do take that time. And then you just have to have such short windows. I mean, for us, we have a pool, so we're pretty fortunate to survive. But you just can't stay outside in long stretches like I'm used to. It's definitely a humbling thing, but I know there's people out here who've lived here their whole life and they know what's coming. It's totally fine. But
yeah, it's got to be interesting to see the lifestyle, adjusting to the lifestyle and seeing how native Arizonians kind of know this stuff automatically. And you're just realizing, okay, it's been 5 minutes. I got to get back inside. So yeah, it's a tough adjustment.
I think I've already made a bunch of dumb decisions, but hey, that's part of parenting. That's kind of what you do. I want to talk about today. We're going to unpack an article that you and Betz wrote, Team Matt, as they call him.
That's right.
Side note, Matthews, like, do they get along? Like, I would say Kyle's kind of have bad reputations out there that, I think there's a meme or, of just Kyle's being loud and obnoxious people. And I have a couple Kyles that I really like, and then a couple Kyles I don't like so much. So any hot takes on Matthews?
Matthews are cool. It's a super common name. I mean, especially kind of in the area I'm from. And I've met a ton of Matthews in my life and have no problem with any of them. Most of them are very good friends. So I think, if obviously doesn't matter for Betz, he's already kind of gone through the naming process. But if you have a kid coming up, you're thinking about a name, Matthew, Matty, all great options. I've never met a Matt I didn't like. So I'm +1 on the Matt train.
Well, Kyle, it's a bit more volatile, which leads us into the article you wrote. It's about embracing volatility, and you guys were all about quantifying what variance looks like in best ball. Betz and I talk a lot about win rates. We talk about opportunity costs for players and where you can actually take them and who's actually going to help your team. So for instance, last year you had players like we'll discuss in a second, but Deontay Johnson and Mike Williams were the ones that were highlighted in the article. Deontay Johnson's been a safe PPR option. You knew what you were getting. Mike Williams, 1 week, he would win you a ton of money in DFS. The next wouldn't even show up. So we're talking about volatility and embracing that. We're getting at a question that is kind of the stereotypical thing now with best ball is this player better in best ball? The Deshaun Jackson types, and does it carry any weight? We talked about this actually a little bit on the main show, but I'm glad we have a format here that is completely devoted to it. And so my question for you is, how did you go from the question of, is this player better in best ball, a big question like that, to figuring this out? So in other words, what was the methodology that you used to start this conversation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think kind of just framing the question, what's really nice about best ball is you have this really well-defined metric of win rate, top 6 rate, et cetera, that tells you kind of the value of a player in terms of winning a fantasy league. So I think that's very important. The tricky thing with best ball is that in standard leagues, the most important factor when drafting a player is their mean, in a sense, like the average, what you estimate they're going to score. And if I can get really nerdy for a second, that's called the first moment of a distribution. Best ball takes it another level and asks about the second moment, which is related to the variance of a player, and kind of the variance of their outcomes. And again, we'll dive into this. In standard leagues, variance generally is not a good thing. I wrote an article last year. If you have a fantasy team that's above average, you want players to be more consistent, because inconsistency, when a player is inconsistent, you have more to lose than you have to gain when your team is already good. And I kind of laid that out better in the article. In best ball, it's the complete opposite. We're going to dive into it, but you want to swing for the fences. So the question that you want to define is, okay, how does variance affect the value of a player? How does variance affect the win rate of a roster? And the way I think about kind of solving these questions, there's generally two ways. One, we can look at the data that we have, and we have all this amazing data that we can crunch and see if we can tease out relationships. And two, we can actually try to bootstrap this ourselves, build a computer program that kind of simulates what fantasy leagues look like, play with a couple of variables, run the simulation a bunch, and then kind of see how these different lineups do. So those are the two main methodologies that I have when I'm thinking about any question: empirical, looking at the data we have, and simulation, trying to run things that, we create in our computer.
Yeah, I feel like it's usually an either or that people do. They're like, okay, well, I have this cool model that I'm going to run a ton of simulations, what it said. But also, like you said, we have the historical data of, in front of us. Like, I can use tools, like I shout out to RotoViz, but I use their tool all the time in their Underdog Best Ball Explorer to talk about win rates and talk about different positional lineups and roster construction. So you're saying, hey, in this article, I want to look at both because they're both valuable and they both matter. So from there, knowing that you wanted to do that, I'm going to just sound really stupid here. How the heck do you run simulations? How does that work?
Yeah, good question. I'm not going to jump through all the details of the algorithm because they're laid out in the article. But the way I kind of think about it is, this is a little bit lame as well, but I like to imagine what would you do if you had 1,000 years and you had a pencil and paper and you could write basically you could do all this work, but it would take you a long time because you're a human, right? A computer can do that way, way faster, right? So if you can set up a task that will get you the answer, but it would take a lot of work for a human to do, it's probably a pretty good task for a computer. And in this case, what that task is creating two lineups and seeing if the lineup with the more volatile player beats the other player or beats the other lineup, right? Very simple at the end of the day. It's two lineups, one is more volatile player, which one wins. But we want to do that hundreds of thousands of times. That would take a long time for a human to put those lineups together, see which one wins, write down which one, that would take days to do, right? But a computer can do it in 20 seconds. So in simulations, I think of, okay, what's the simplest task that we can do? Code that in the computer and run it many, many times. And then on the flip side, which you're mentioning, which we'll talk about, great data from RotoViz, NFL Fast R is a data source I use a lot. In that sense, you're doing something completely different where you're running analytics on the data. But the simulation, I like to think of, okay, what can I make the computer do faster than me?
So you looked at data from, like you mentioned, over 100,000 different lineups, comparing, ones that are highly volatile and ones that have kind of that median outcome. When you're looking at all of that, 100,000's starting to get to a big number. Like if you said 2,000 or 3,000, I'd be like, oh, okay, well that's nice. I think I could actually do that myself. But when you start to get up to that number, it's a lot. Does that amount of data ever feel overwhelming? Because, our goal is to take that and then give actionable information, which, the rest of this episode is going to be talking about the key takeaways. Does that ever get overwhelming with that amount of data and that many lineups?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it can get scary, right? You can start to think oh my goodness. But I think what the crucial discrepancy is adding rows. So another matchup, that's less tricky than adding columns, adding different variables. In addition to who wins, I want to look at the score and I want to look at the time and I want to look at all these different variables. Adding rows, it's okay, we have a bigger data set, but we kind of know the format for everything. And that once you kind of get used to it, it doesn't really add a lot of complexity. And we actually kind of need a lot of simulations because a lot of these metrics and statistics are relying on big data sets the law of large numbers, the central limit theorem in some cases, where we require a big sample size to be confident about the results that we're getting. So the short answer is, if you construct your question well and you have a clean data set, adding more rows is not going to feel like you're adding a lot of complexity.
Perfect. All right, before we get into our key takeaways from the study, let's take a quick break. All right, so if you got lost in some of that, welcome to the club. I got to edit this article, and so I will say I love editing your articles because I know I'm going to learn something. I also have to read back through it because I can't assume I understand what I just read sometimes. And so, but I will say this. I think you're good at taking big piece of information, a lot of data, and then turning it into what's actionable. Usually you do this for me, so I'm just bragging on you as an editor. You usually end up emboldening whatever that key takeaway point is at the end of a paragraph. You're like, this is all of that is what I'm trying to say right here. So that's super helpful. If you're ever reading an article, make sure you look at that. But let's first talk about how Best Ball, the format, really is different in terms of volatility, the way that we would think about redraft, the way we would think about DFS. Like in DFS, my opportunity cost is like, I lost money, but I can start all over next week. In redraft, I start a player and, I got a bad result, but I can play the waivers. I can trade. I can put somebody else in. In Best Ball, our lineup is set and the computer's going to pick the optimal one. But Best Ball lineups inherently have a layer of bust protection, right? Like if one of your wide receivers plays bad, hopefully you make it up from having 8 or 9 different other guys that can come through. So how does that shift our mindset, knowing that Best Ball has some layer of insurance in terms of busting?
Totally. When I look at a player, I think of players, or at least in terms of fantasy scoring, as a distribution, and usually that distribution is mound shaped, right? Bell curve, however you want to call it. But in Best Ball, the left side, the left tail, the bust games, that part of the distribution is usually shaved off just because of the definition and the dynamics of Best Ball. When a player scores 0 points, 1 point, you're probably going to have another player who outscored them, and you get to throw that score out. So that adds a very interesting, from a statistical perspective, from a fantasy perspective, thinking about these players when we have the left tail of the distribution kind of truncated.
So when I'm looking at certain players, like I from this article, my biggest takeaway is if I'm deciding between two players, then the one that has a little bit higher, volatility, and even though if they have a similar projection, like that's who I want. So the players we were talking about most recently were Deontay Johnson and Mike Williams. Mike Williams is kind of like a superstar on this podcast. A couple years ago, he won Betz a lot of money on Showdown, and he's someone that, we're kind of suckered for the Chargers. My question is, how many spike weeks do I need? So if I look back through Mike Williams' game logs from this past year, remember he started off super hot, kind of went hot and cold, and then came on towards the end of the year. I don't know that answer, right? I don't know how many spike weeks Mike Williams is going to have. But when I'm deciding between players, what am I looking at in terms of saying this player is actually volatile? Like, I can look back and say, Mike Williams can give me 4 or 5 weeks that are through the roof. Or like Terry McLaurin last year, in redraft, he had 4 weeks where he was like a top 10 player. He was awesome. And he wasn't usable the rest of the time. Like, it was actually a train wreck. So how can I figure that out in terms of not knowing how many I'm going to get? Like, how many do I need in terms of spike weeks, specifically for wide receivers?
That's a great question. And I think I'm going to get to the bolden part of the article that you were mentioning, because I know I've been just
you're good.
talking
a lot
great. About random statistics. But the way we kind of looked at it is we wanted to estimate what, like you said, the effective volatility on win rate. And the bottom line that we found is for a player with double the volatility. And when I say volatility, I mean variance of scoring across weeks. So imagine Mike Williams has double the volatility of another wide receiver, maybe Deontay Johnson. The player with double the volatility will increase the top 6 probability of that entire roster by 10%, which is massive, right? if a player has twice the volatility, we see plenty of players with high volatility. They get a really big jump for the entire roster. And this requires a lot of the other variables to be held constant, right? Like they have to kind of have the same draft capital because there's an opportunity cost in drafting a player. The rest of the builds matter. The week that these scores come matters, kind of distribution. But that's a general result, is that volatility is really important. And kind of putting that in even more understandable terms, when I looked at importance in terms of affecting the win rate, we found that variance volatility was about a third to a half as important compared to how much a player scores. So obviously, how much a player scores is the most important thing by far. You want your players to score a lot of points, but volatility is like 33 to 50% as important as that, which means it's massively important. And I think the takeaway is that, whenever you're picking a player, you're of course considering how much he's going to score. You have to consider how high his variance is going to be and how he's going to score those points, I think is the big takeaway. So in the Mike Williams case, he's a great, in the Mike Williams case, he's high volatility. You expect a much higher win probability for his roster.
No, it's interesting because now we're at a situation looking at ADP where my boy Keenan Allen, love Keenan Allen more than anything else. They're back to back right now. It's wide receiver 12 for Keenan Allen, wide receiver 13 on Underdog for Mike Williams. And so people are actually having to make that decision, a player that is super consistent, that we know what Keenan Allen is, right? 100 receptions, 1,100 yards, 6 touchdowns. That's what he's been the last 4 or 5 years, and Mike Williams is going to be a roller coaster ride. So if I see that their projections are similar, and I see these players back to back, am I crazy? Because in my last couple of drafts, I've abandoned my heart, and I've been taking Mike Williams ahead of Keenan Allen.
No, that is absolutely not crazy. If you're controlling for everything and all the variables are the same. And in this case, these are 2 wide receivers on the same team. So a lot of the variables are the same. But one player has much higher volatility. You want to pick that player. That ADP that you were mentioning, it might have baked in some potential injury risk for Mike Williams. We all know he's a super aggressive player, jumps really high, sometimes lands in the wrong way. So that could be baked into the ADP, but that's a perfect case of kind of looking at these rankings and saying, this doesn't look like it's adjusting for volatility. I would 100 times out of 100 take Mike Williams over Keenan Allen in a best ball draft.
Nice. It's scary for me when I look at how bullish we are on Mike Williams. I know he just got a big contract extension. He did finish as a wide receiver 1, but our show overall, Andy, Mike, and Jason are very bullish. They all have him as a wide receiver 1 right now in their projections. And in home leagues, in sleeper, on formats like that, he is going in the 5th round, which is very different than in best ball, where a format where we're, shooting for the moon. We're not trying to get 3rd place and get in the playoffs. We're trying to win it all. So volatility is really good for win rates. What we talked about in terms of increasing your overall rosters, but we also have to have the quantity of receivers. We actually have to do that. In underdog lineups, you have to start 3 wide receivers each week and a potential flex. So knowing that roster construction, knowing what I have to get out of wide receivers and what we've seen from the win rates, nobody got to the finals last year with less than 6 wide receivers. You need, we would say 8 or 9 is probably better in terms of win rates. Does that change at all in terms of the collection of wide receivers you're trying to get? You're not trying to get all Mike Williams on your rosters.
Yeah, a really good question. I think the kind of the breakdown that you and Betz were talking about a couple episodes ago makes sense. I think it was 7+ wide receivers, because you're totally right. If you only have 2 wide receivers and Mike Williams busts, you don't have the bust protection that you thought you did, because, you just don't have enough wide receivers to start. So you need a big group of wide receivers to actually ensure that bust protection is working. And in terms of what you said, not focusing on entirely Mike Williams, maybe mixing in some consistent players, some boom bust players. That's interesting too, because you could see a world where you just have all completely volatile players and you just hope they hit at different times. But it's probably a more reasonable strategy to say, okay, I have a couple of solid, dependable wide receivers that I know will give me that floor, that kind of high floor of bust protection when my kind of rock stars don't have an on week. So I think that's a very reasonable way to approach roster construction.
Yeah. And I know we think of ADP as just hey, this is where someone was drafted, but you're also baking in, this is the type of score I'm getting from a player at this draft spot. So Michael Pittman's going a couple spots later, and his outcomes last year, he only had 3 finishes inside the top 15, and he tailed off in the second half, but it was much more dependable. So last year where you could get Michael Pittman, and I'm tooting our own horn right here, like you can get him at wide receiver 50 last year. Like nobody was on Michael Pittman. This year, if you're drafting him at wide receiver 14, 15, wherever, then you're counting on that score each week. And yes, you're going to love it when you get to ride the highs, but you're also saying this guy's going to score a certain amount of points that is deserving of this draft spot. So last question here before we get into some player takes. If you are deciding on players later on in your draft, and we've mostly been talking wide receivers because they are the most volatile position in terms of week to week. Tight ends pretty heavily influenced by touchdowns. But when you are going later in draft, there are players that I would say typically have been the safe floor player, the Jamison Crowders types, where it's like, okay, he's not going to poop the bed, but he's also not going to go for 6 for 140. It's just not really who he is. But you have some other players in that range where Van Jefferson, like he's a big play guy, goes a little bit later. DJ Chark, another player that's kind of been a boom bust throughout his career. If you are deciding on those types of players and you are in the, 12th, 13th, 14th round, you're just trying to build out the rest of your wide receiver roster. Is there any lean towards high variance, or is it kind of situation by situation? Like Crowder's tied to Josh Allen, so that's why his ADP has risen. Where these other players, it's like, I have no idea what I'm going to get out of DJ Chark.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the answer depends on how your draft has gone. If your wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 are Mike Williams and Tyreek Hill, who are both, boom bust players, it might make sense to get that steady floor of Jamison Crowder. However, if you have, Devontae Adams and Deontay Johnson, who are very steady, Devontae Adams does have some boom games, but in general, those are two very steady wide receivers. It can't hurt to take a shot on someone like a Van Jefferson or someone like a DJ Chark that you were mentioning. I'm trying to think of other boom wide receivers, but it makes sense to kind of balance your team. I think, if you focused on volatility early, maybe get the consistency later and vice versa.
Nice. All right. So let's get into some player discussions. And I would be remiss if I didn't use this drop.
Checking in with the wise guys.
We used to use this on our DFS show that when we talk about something really smart, we'd use that drop. And so I felt bad that I had it here, and we just went through some good data stuff. I mean, I just needed to use it. Do you feel okay that I used that for you?
I feel great. I went through a stretch where I was really into mob movies, like mafia movies, and wise guys. It's like a good fellow, a wise guy, a mob guy. So I had a different interpretation instead of like the smart. I was thinking like the Sopranos, but that's great too. It all works.
No, dude, that's even better. Now I'm gonna think about the drop very differently every time we use it. Yeah. All right, so we discussed some players that have similar ADPs earlier. Talked a lot about Big Mike Willie because he's our boy. But I want to go through each position. You and I can kind of go back and forth, and I'll throw out the name. You can start us off, but we're going to look through players at each position that have, some more volatile outcomes than maybe people realize. I think a lot of times with players, we've seen what they've been. We've seen their past. And yes, past success, the past is a window of the future. But it doesn't mean we just copy and paste what these players have been. And that's what I love about football is that we're looking for a range of outcomes. So we're starting a series right now on the Fantasy Footballers website about wide receiver ones and who could be a wide receiver one, who has the range of outcomes. I mean, did anyone have in the range of outcomes Cooper Kupp being the wide receiver one, putting together, second best wide receiver season of all time? Like, I love thinking about players and what could be and where the range of outcomes are. So let's talk about this first one. Dak Prescott. I was in a draft and I passed on him recently. He's QB 10 in ADP. And I really asked myself, like, can Dak with his weapons, it's a different wide receiver group behind CeeDee Lamb. I have to count on Dalton Schultz to be elite again. Can he give me the range of outcomes? Can he give me a top 3 to 4 or 5 season? And that's kind of what I was debating. So what are your thoughts on Dak?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought Dak up because he's way more volatile than I think we give credit for. And again, volatility is kind of the watchword of this episode. Last season, he had 5 performances inside the top 3 at the position. So the QB3 or better. So 5 weeks. But he also had 5 weeks outside of the QB 15 range. So outside of the top 15. So 5 weeks where he's helping you win your week and 5 weeks where he's completely letting you down. What's interesting is that his ADP in standard leagues is the QB 7 off the board. And in best ball, he's lower. You mentioned, the QB 10 off the board recently. And I like to think of Dak compared to a player like Jalen Hurts, where Jalen Hurts, I think in general, fantasy managers think of Jalen Hurts as a very volatile player because he kind of has that rushing upside. But in reality, if you look at Jalen Hurts' kind of game log from last year, he was great because he was very steady. He was the QB3 twice, and that was it in terms of how high he was. And he never really let you down. He let you down kind of more at the end of the season, but he was very steady throughout the beginning. And in best ball, he's ranked higher than Dak Prescott. And again, you mentioned we don't want to just cut and paste from last year. Obviously, Dak has lost Amari Cooper. Jalen Hurts has gained A.J. Brown, who's a very volatile guy. But my kind of attitude, especially with Dak Prescott, is I still believe in that upside, especially with another year removed from his injury, the rushing upside. Until he proves me wrong, I'm very in on him for best ball drafts. He has CeeDee Lamb, who I think is going to take another step forward. And I still think he gives you that boom upside. And I'm, again, okay with those bust downsides.
Yeah, with Dak last year, there was a stretch where it was kind of rough. I think it was about, 3/4 of the way through the season, finished strong. And Hurts, I felt that he was my quarterback the entire year in my home league, and then pooped the bed the very last week and cost me a championship.
Yep.
But with the Cowboys, they're playing a first-place schedule, and their first-place games include Bengals, Tampa Bay at home, and then the Rams on the road. So they have a couple of games already built in that are kind of going to be tough and going to be high-scoring. And you do have to ask yourself the question, when Dak has volume, Dak has been awesome for fantasy, like to the point where you're getting somebody who can be the QB1. Now, his rushing touchdowns were not where we've seen in the past, so if that kind of returns, I think you can get there. And the price tag, I love it. I think normally you'd be paying up for Dak in that QB 4 to 7 range, and you're not getting it there. The options apart from CeeDee Lamb are way cheaper this year, in terms of where you're drafting Cowboys players, even Ezekiel Elliott. So in terms of stacking, I think you can get that outcome. I mean, we were all about Cowboys last year. Betz and I had a wager on Cowboys to lead the league in scoring, which they did, over 31 points a game. So this is an offense that I feel like the consensus is they're taking a step back because the Eagles, have taken a step forward. And I think at the ADP, you're getting a relative value that, week to week, you're going to get spike games. Would you feel comfortable in builds where Dak is your QB1? So you have Dak, and let's say, you wait a couple more rounds and you get, someone that's a little bit later, like, I don't know, Mac Jones is your QB2 and maybe get a QB3. Like, are you okay with Dak being the guy for your team?
Yeah, so I'm a Patriots fan, so Mac Jones will be my QB1 and then Dak my QB2. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm very comfortable with that. I think if you compare Dak with a steady, I'm thinking Matt Ryan, right? A little bit more of a steady QB2. I would be very happy with that. You brought up great points about the first place schedule. My thinking with those games against the Bucs, the Rams, and the Bengals, defenses are tougher to project across years than offenses are. So Aaron Donald obviously just re-signed with the Rams. That's great news for them. But we're pretty confident all of those offenses will be good. We're less confident that the defenses will still be dominant. So those could even end up being shootouts, right? Where Dak leads some awesome comeback and post big game. So I'm very happy with Dak as my QB1, especially if I'm targeting some RB wide receiver upside earlier in the draft.
Yeah, he's going 85th overall, so it is kind of nice to be able to stockpile players, at running back, wide receiver. Maybe you get an early tight end like a Mark Andrews, or, I've had drafts where I went Schultz and then Dak right after that, and I got the stack. I did get CeeDee Lamb, but I think I got somebody that can be a difference maker at the tight end position. So, yeah, I like that we brought up Dak because it feels like he's a player that's just been dependable for fantasy, but his spike weeks are ones that I want, and I want on a team that's a cheaper stack than normal. Let's briefly mention Jameis Winston. You put him on the show doc. So I've said this before on the show. I'll say it again. Chris Olave might be one of my favorite players to draft this year in terms of where he's going in ADP. We don't know with Michael Thomas. There's a report that came out today that he's doubtful in terms of just participating in OTAs. So I love Chris Olave. I love Alvin Kamara. But Jameis is, I'm not going to get old Jameis, right? Like, am I going to get Jameis that, throws 50 times a game? Probably not. But tell me why you're interested in Jameis. Yeah,
Jameis, I think, is a perfect QB2 because he just always represents that fantasy upside. You mentioned Chris Olave. That's an amazing weapon to have. I have who knows, but I have a feeling that Michael Thomas will be back, at least playing a bit this year. Alvin Kamara is an amazing safety valve. And Jameis is not afraid to throw it deep. And that's exactly what I want. I think last year, before he went down with the injury, he had 2 games already inside the top 5 at the position. So he is a perfect option that can win you a week if he plays well. And if they're playing from behind, which, they play the Bucs twice a year, so they will be playing from behind a couple of times. So I really like targeting him in those later rounds, especially on the flip side of what we were just talking about. If you have a really solid, dependable QB1, Jameis can inject some volatility at the end of your draft.
And the Saints, just for reference, week 17, we talk a lot about that for best ball. They play at the Eagles. So that's a pairing that if you want, let's say you did get A.J. Brown early, or you have Jalen Hurts. Saints and Eagles are 2 teams that I think are in the playoff hunt. We like them, and they have a lot of options. So, yeah, if you get a Jameis stack and you pair them with like a Miles Sanders or, Devonta Smith, so somebody from the Eagles, keep that in mind as you're going for a player like that. Especially, Jameis might be slow to start the year, but if he's your QB2, you're not asking for him to get it for you every single week. All right.
Yeah. And I love that you guys talk about that. It's a lot about intra-team stacking where it's Jameis and Olave. But I love that you guys discuss the inter-team where you focus on a specific week and you want guys in the same game because those outcomes are correlated. And if they score a lot, they go. So I think it's a really great point that you highlighted.
Yeah. So we've mentioned before Chiefs and Bengals was a big game this past year. But the highest scoring game of that week was the Lions and Seahawks, all right, with 80 points scored. It was crazy. It was DK Metcalf had 3 touchdowns. Rashad Penny went bananas. Amon-Ra St. Brown. So even if you had a simple pairing, imagine ending your draft with Rashad Penny and Amon-Ra St. Brown, you won a best ball championship with that. Let's go to running back, a position that I would say, we get safe volume. That's usually what we want. We're like, okay, give me guaranteed 15, 20 touches. That's what I want. But you have a player on here we're already hot and heavy on the podcast. It's Aaron Jones. There's so much to like about Aaron Jones. His ADP has crept up from when we started talking about him. It's not because of us. We weren't moving the lines. But people were drafting Aaron Jones earlier and earlier. His ADP is now 18th overall. A couple of weeks ago, you could get him in the 3rd round. That's not happening anymore. But tell me why you think Aaron Jones is a player who we should be targeting, because A.J. Dillon's in the mix. Aaron Jones fell off a little bit. He was still an RB1, but barely compared to what he was the previous 2 years. Why should we be targeting Aaron Jones? Only give me the good stuff.
Definitely. So, again, it all comes back to volatility, and everyone who's either, had Aaron Jones on their team or faced him on an opposing team knows that he can easily bust or he can go off and score 40 plus points in a week. I mean, at the start of last year, he was the RB 53 in week 1 and then turned that around with an RB2 performance in week 2. So he is totally, can go off at any given time. And what's interesting for Aaron Jones for me is, at least when I was looking at it, his best ball and standard ADP were the same, which, almost feels like arbitrage in a sense. It's not baking into the calculation, the volatility that he brings. I think with the emergence of A.J. Dillon, that kind of throws a little bit of cold water on the fire. But what's more important to me is the fact that Devontae Adams has left town. There's a massive target vacuum. We know Aaron Rodgers is back with the Packers. And the Packers did, draft a wide receiver, but maybe not as high as we thought. So I think Aaron Jones has the potential to be one of the top targets in this really high-powered offense. And paired with the volatility, I really like that. And it's great to hear that he's been creeping up, but also I don't have to creep up too much before all the listeners can get their Aaron Jones stacks on their team.
Yeah, the 2 players that I have been the most vocal about this offseason, Aaron Jones, and Betz has been right there with me, and Chris Olave. So I'm a little scared that they're going to eventually get to the point where oh no, I can't draft them anymore. I liked them before they were cool. That's really what this is all about. Fantasy football, right? Yeah. I like that band before anyone listened to them. So yeah, I think Aaron Jones, 70 receptions is on the table for this team. And Aaron Rodgers has never supported rookie wide receivers. It wouldn't shock me if it just gets spread out between Allen Lazard and Christian Watson, the rest of their bunch, like Amari Rodgers, Randall Cobb, it just kind of gets spread out and we don't really know what to do with it. So I think Aaron Jones is a great play. And you mentioned earlier, his best ball ADP and his ADP and redraft leagues are pretty similar. And that tells me that people aren't really baking in the upside that, like, Aaron Jones can finish in the top 5 at the position. Like, it wouldn't shock me at all.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's really taken. So I have drafts right now. I have one going on where Aaron Jones is my RB1, and I felt totally comfortable with it. He's going in a spot where I think a lot of people are getting him as an RB2. I think that's totally fine. But you definitely can do a lot of work with him. Let's talk about a player for my Falcons that is all over the map, okay, depending on people's views and what they think about him. Andy actually brought him up on the Thursday show as his wild card pick, and him and I sat down and we really started putting the criteria together. Okay, has there ever been a 31-year-old running back who's / wide receiver who is now in his 10th season but just had his best season ever? Like, there's no template you could find to see, what Cordell Patterson is. And the only template you can is if you have gadget players that are like, was he a wide receiver, but he was used as a running back, like Tavon Austin or Percy Harvin? Those players, when they had their best season, they just fell off a cliff right after that. So Cordell Patterson right now is going much later in drafts than I think people realize. He's RB29 just recently. So what do we do with Cordell? He might not even have the role the whole year, week to week. I can't depend on 10 carries. So what do you do with him?
Yeah, Super Bowl champion Cordell Patterson with the Patriots has really been one of my favorites. So I just had to slide that in there. Has been one of my favorite kind of players to watch this offseason. Those words you were saying, all over the map, wild card, unicorn, that's exactly what we want in best ball, right? He has the receiving upside. Even if he doesn't get it down on the ground, even if he gets less than 10 carries, he could still catch 2 touchdowns. I mean, we saw it last season. He had 4 games in the top 7, 5 games as the RB37 or worse. And the nice thing is, you're absolutely right. We have to be very cognizant of age for running backs. They fall off a cliff very quickly. However, as you also mentioned, the draft capital you're giving up to draft Cordell Patterson is not that high. So it's not like you're taking a bet on maybe a Derrick Henry, who I think is very much worth drafting very early. But if he does fall off that age cliff, it's much more of a hit for your roster. Cordell is going to be your RB2 or your RB3. So if, father time comes knocking, it's not going to be as big of an issue. So I love, drafting him in best ball drafts. I think the Falcons, no offense, are not going to be an amazing team this year.
How dare you?
But they have a couple of really exciting, I know I'm going against the grain, but I think they have a couple of really exciting offensive options, Drake London, obviously, Kyle Pitts, and Cordell, that are worth a look in best ball leagues when they are down late in games and trying to put points on the board and mount a crazy comeback. So I think he's perfect for best ball.
I'll say this about the Falcons. That's a fun team. That trio you just mentioned, that's fun. And I think that we'll have some fun moments for fantasy. We'll see if they push it in terms of volume. That's never been a Marcus Mariota thing, and then a rookie quarterback. So I think we're still a year away, and who knows if CP's even on the roster. But yeah, I don't mind him if you're getting him that late. I was putting out some research recently to our Discord channel. If you want to get in on that, you can go to jointhefoot.com. But I was looking at when to take your 4th running back and your 3rd running back in terms of what's optimal. And so I think Cordell is actually in that range where if you get him as your RB3, you're not asking for a weekly score, you're asking for spike weeks. And then you take your 4th running back, past the 12th or 13th round. I think it's a good spot for him. I thought that based on what he did last year, people would overreact, but that just that didn't happen. All right, let's talk about a couple wide receivers and tight end, and then we'll get out of here. You have a name on here that I've actually closed my eyes and just said I don't know what to do with him this year. It's Darnell Mooney of the Chicago Bears. Listen, we both love Justin Fields. Betz and I both do. We believe in his talent. Mike is a huge Justin Fields fan. I think every single day we send ourselves one message that just says, I still believe. Him and Trey Lance, we basically haven't moved on those in terms of them being good NFL quarterbacks, and they can be good for fantasy. But Darnell Mooney was air yards central. Hey, throw it deep, and you don't get any points for those. So how are you treating him where it seems like he's the clear number 1 in this offense? They're probably going to be bad. I've already taken the under on the Bears this year. So how does he fit in terms of a roster, and what are you looking at? He's going as the wide receiver 30. So you're not asking for him to do, a weekly score. Do you think that ADP is warranted with Mooney?
Yeah. Again, I'm very pro Mooney. I have him in one of my keeper leagues. He's definitely going to be one of my keepers. I know I'm a little bit late to the boat. Andy had him as my guy last year, which obviously was a good play. I think there's a lot to like with Darnell Mooney. He's going to be a second-year wide receiver. We know they generally take a step forward. Justin Fields has a little bit more experience, albeit not amazing experience, but they
experience is experience.
Yes. I do sometimes feel that the top wide receivers on bad teams are overdrafted, and I actually am staying away from Darnell Mooney in redraft leagues. But in best ball, I think he's the perfect fit. I mean, I won't go through the stats, but he was very volatile last year, as you mentioned. He has a ton of air yards. He's a deep threat. He's a speedster. And those are exactly the traits that we want. And I think as your wide receiver 3, just as you mentioned with Cordell Patterson, you're asking for him to have a long bomb touchdown or a couple of touchdowns, which he very much has the potential to do. The other nice thing is that you can very cheaply stack him in Fields, like you were talking about. I mean, I think Fields is the QB 17 off the board. So late in drafts, you can get a stack that when they go off, maybe it's only a couple of weeks of the season, but when they go off, you have a really good chance of winning the week. So I'm out on Mooney in redraft. I'm very much in on best ball.
No, I love it with Fields because at QB 18, last year people were saying we're drafting the rookie quarterbacks, Lance and Fields, and drafting them in a range right in that fringe QB1 range where they said they have to be an integral part of my team. Now you're asking Fields to be a QB2, even a QB3 for your roster. Let's say you get 2 quarterbacks in that kind of, 7 to 10 range. Let's say, you get Dak and somebody else. Like, you're asking Fields to put up 3 or 4 weeks, and you have a roster that looks very different. Nobody's stacking Bears. Like, nobody's banging down the doors to stack Bears. Maybe get Cole Kmet later. Throw in a Velus Jones if you want to. So I like them in terms of getting unique from everyone else. They're going to be bad. I think they're really going to be bad, but for fantasy, we're looking for a couple of spike weeks. Tyler Lockett, we're going to talk about him, and I wish Betz was here because he's been a Tyler Lockett truther forever, every single year, and when he found that Russ was leaving, he was so sad because Tyler Lockett is his main man. He is kind of the picture of up and down volatility. But man, this year we're not having to pay anywhere close to what we had to in the past. Right now, he is going as the wide receiver 44 behind names like Christian Kirk, Hunter Renfrow, and DeAndre Hopkins, who is not even going to be playing for at least 7 weeks of the year. So talk to me about Tyler Lockett because we love him.
Absolutely. I mean, the drop in ADP is absolutely warranted. You lose a Hall of Fame quarterback to get Drew Lock, who is obviously a far cry from even probably what is a good starting quarterback in the NFL. But when you're thinking about drafting Tyler Lockett in best ball, you just have to think, is he still going to be able to attain those boom weeks? We know he's going to have a lot of bust weeks. He had plenty of them last year, so that's nothing new. He was still a great player to have. And is he still going to be able to have multi-touchdown games, long bombs? And honestly, I think the answer is yes. Drew Lock is not a very competent quarterback. He's Mr. Irresponsible. But the nice thing is that he's not afraid to throw it deep. He's not afraid to take shots. And I think that matches well with Tyler Lockett's skill set. So that wide receiver 44 number is just insane to me. I think having Lockett as my wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5 is amazing to kind of sprinkle into different rosters. He's going to have big weeks where he kind of delivers you a win. And I think he's fallen way too far. And I think it's time to get that ADP back up closer.
Yeah. And we're getting reports that Geno Smith was running with the ones. And, there was a stretch where Geno Smith was actually fine, especially production wise. I wish Russ was there because of just their historical connection when he targets him. But I love the price tag. Like if you told me he was wide receiver 25 or 25 to 28, like I'd be like, I'm probably out. I'd have to count on him to be my wide receiver too. But man, I'm getting a player that in his, game logs, but just what we see on the field is he's a big play player and that's not going away. So love Tyler Lockett, love where you get him there. I want to talk about one more player, Dawson Knox at tight end. He's tied to Josh Allen. I think that's why we love him the most. And last year we got to see, the tight ends or the touchdown spike a little bit more than what we'd seen his first 2 years. He's in a contract year. OJ Howard's now on the team, but at tight end 9, what's so enticing to you?
Yeah, and a name you mentioned earlier, Cole Kmet. I think of Dawson Knox and Cole Kmet as opposite sides of the coin. They had similar usage in terms of receptions, targets. Dawson Knox way overachieved and Cole Kmet way underachieved. I think he caught like 0 or 1.
0, yeah.
On 1 touchdowns last year. I don't have the numbers in front. Yeah, 0 touchdowns last year. So in redraft leagues, I am very in on Cole Kmet if I don't take one of the elite tight ends early. I think, again, a bad offense, but he's getting targeted a lot. And those touchdowns will start to come. And I'm also very out on Dawson Knox because we know touchdowns are not very sticky year over year. And I think you're going to pay the price. However, in best ball, that touchdown up and down is exactly what we want, right? He's shown that he has a knack for getting targeted in the red zone. He has another year of trust with Josh Allen, and he has the capacity to give you a multi-touchdown game. And if you're getting a multi-touchdown game from a tight end that's not named Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, or Kyle Pitts, that's really, really good for your lineup. It means you're probably going to win that week if someone booms like that. So tight end is kind of a desert, which we all know. I think there's not as much nuance going from redraft to best ball because the top tight ends in redraft, the 3 I mentioned are going to be the top tight ends in best ball. And, the fall off from there is going to be equally steep. But I do think Dawson Knox is a name where you can get him a little bit later and he shows he has that upside that could really help your lineups.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what 3 tight end builds look like this year because if the standard build is going to be taking a elite player, at the very top, you're taking Andrews, Kelce, Pitts, Waller, Kittle, like those are the players that people are going to be having 2 tight ends total on their team. And that's it. I don't mind throwing Dalton Schultz in that mix. Hopefully he gets a contract extension. But other than that, you're going to be seeing a lot of 3 tight end builds that have your, Dawson Knox, Irv Smith Jr., and then maybe at the very end you throw in like a Hayden Hurst, somebody that's like tied to Joe Burrow. Those tight ends that are tied to elite offenses, that there's going to be weeks where they just don't do anything. Like Hayden Hurst, it's like, okay, well, he like ran a couple of routes and that's it. There's going to be other weeks where his score was, 50 and a touchdown. And that was awesome for where you could get him. That's what Dawson Knox is to me too. So are you comfortable taking him as your tight end 1? But if he's your tight end 1 in best ball, are you going for 3 tight ends?
Yeah, absolutely. He's below that threshold for me where if he is the first tight end that I take, I'm going to have to build that out with 2 more, especially because he brings that volatility. But I think among the 3 tight end builds, he's like the best top tight end that you could have. I think the 4 you mentioned are kind of that line, and then my trust falls off pretty quickly.
Yeah. So other names that I think in good offenses, I'll just throw out a couple of tight end names. Irv Smith Jr., I think can have weeks where he's catching those touchdowns. Tyler Conklin's gone. I think he could be, 3rd or 4th target in the offense. So I like him. A lot of people like Albert O, just because Russell Wilson's with him. So his ADP has not crept up as much as I thought. He's at 144 overall. And then another name, Gerald Everett is an eternal tease in terms of athleticism. And if you go through and look at what he's done in his career, the other day we were talking about sleeper names for a show, and Jason and I sat down, we're talking about Gerald Everett, and I was like, I don't really have many stats to back up why he could be good. Like, there's not much in his history. The thing I can say is that Justin Herbert, so far in 2 years, has historically looked at the tight end position, and Jared Cook has had outlier seasons. So what if Gerald Everett is just a much younger version of Jared Cook? And if you knew you were getting that, you're getting a tight end 2 for best ball, and that's what you want. So and
that's a reasonable argument to make. And one other name I throw in is Hunter Henry. I feel like we're just naming all the tight ends at this point, but he showed a really nice connection with Mac Jones last year. Was targeted a lot in the red zone, even in the 10 zone. And that's the kind of upside you want. They have another year of building camaraderie, and the Patriots obviously have a prestigious history in the past couple decades of having really prolific fantasy tight ends.
All right, so I want to end the show and asking you a Patriots question. Okay, so
yes, please.
I was looking at contract information the other day, just looking at different positions. Can you explain to me why this team has decided to give out contracts to 2 tight ends that are on average averaging the most in terms of 2022 salary, and then they said, hey, you know what, Jonnu? You're going to be a pass blocking tight end, a run blocking tight end, and we're going to play you a stupid amount of money. Do you feel like as a fan that is a bad allocation of resources?
Yeah. So the first answer I'll give is in Bill we trust, and that's it. No, but the real answer I'll give is I think Patriots is a really well-run organization. I think they had a good season last year. They had a quick turnaround, and they're going to be good again this year. The past 2 off seasons, all the contracts you were mentioning last offseason, Nelson Aguilar, they paid a ton. Hunter Henry, Jonnu Smith. To me, that was the reaction. Bill kind of got a little bit annoyed that Brady left for Tampa, and he said, oh yeah, let's reload, let's build the arsenal, spend a ton of money. Very uncharacteristic of Bill. So I think it was a reaction to Tom Brady kind of leaving. And then we saw in this draft as well, I think another bit of a reaction. Obviously, the Pats got blown out by the Bills in the wild card, 47-17. They look super slow, super old. And clearly Bill was a little bit reactionary from that and drafted just a ton of speed. You had kind of the weird Cole Strange pick, Cole Strange pick in the first round, very fast player. Tyquan Thornton, I think that might not be his name. I'm pretty sure that's his name.
Yep.
Obviously a burner, the fastest player in the combine this year. So to me, these past 2 off seasons have been a story of Bill Belichick reacting to something. Maybe he reacts a little bit too much, but I think in general, what's made him a great coach for decades is that he kind of sees the trends and where they're going and adapts to it and is able to adapt over time. That's the optimistic take. If you want the pessimistic take, go to any Patriots tweet and scroll down to the comments and you'll see all that. So.
People are just dogging on them nonstop. I guess you're a little privileged.
Yeah, it is not. Yeah.
You're a little privileged.
Yes.
Well, that about wraps up.
It's been That
about wraps up our show. And if you want to, you can follow DiSorbo on the Twitter sphere at Data Visuals with a Z. And you can get to know him, see all of his work on the Fantasy Footballers website. But until next week, look forward to seeing you guys in the best ball streets. And if you want to shoot Betz a little tweet, you totally can.
Thanks for having me. See you next week.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Fantasy Footballers DFS Podcast. Don't forget to visit us on the web at www.thefantasyfootballers.com.